they view themselves as street organizations, street/social organizations. At one point, I was also a part of one myself. And there's a whole history that goes along with that isn't often told, but needs to, in order to have things be placed in correct perspective. Because it's not just what people see today. There's a yesterday for all of that.
Okay, so what is that history? For someone,
I think a person might find it surprising. It goes all the way back to, and I've thought on it. I think probably the best place to start is, I think you'll be surprised by it. It's like shortly after the Civil War.
I'm not surprised.
You're not surprised by that?
I'm not surprised.
I'm not sure most people's thinking will go back that far at all concerning it. But I mean, obviously, America isn't the newest country, but it is a new country. And some of the events that were taking place during the country's inception, we've now, from an ideological and a governmental standpoint, got away from condoning. Legislation was involved in all of that. And we've been trying to figure out our way as a country and all of our diversity since that. And I think the story definitely traces back to that. So you have this period where we're coming off of, people who were at one point in involuntary servitude. And then that gets basically cut out legislatively anyway from a legal standpoint. There's a lot of questions as to the legitimacy of it, whether or not it just shifted to another, framework, another conversation, to have, or it could be this one if you're interested in, I don't know. But constitutionally, of course, the idea of involuntary servitude, which came to pretty much dominate the environment, the economic environment in the country pretty early on. Didn't start out that way, but it definitely progressed towards it pretty quickly, where it was just a labor class, and we were pretty much accepted to be that. And it wasn't just one culture that was represented in that, though after a while, one culture kind of became the face of it and definitely got the brunt of it. At first, it was just poor people, and it's really kind of always been that. Poor people from Ireland, poor people from, Africa and so forth. But so we get away from the idea of that kind of thing being okay. Constitutionally, we say neither in the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction can any person be placed in involuntary servitude except as punishments for crimes whereof the party should have been duly convicted of a crime. Neither in the United States or any place subject to that jurisdiction can any person be incarcerated unless they've been duly convicted of a crime. Now, that's a loose paraphrase, but that's the 13th Amendment, right, that does away with slavery. So a lot of people say to themselves, I really just shifted it to the penal system. And once more, that's a whole big conversation, too. But coming off of that, you have people who are basically trying to figure out what they're going to do now, after that. You have involuntary servitude, and that was basically your life. And now you have at least a semblance of freedom where you can make more decisions. Nobody can force you to work, but of course you still have to work to provide for yourself. And you had kind of in the southern states, a notion that people should just continue doing what they had always done, and they did, and that became essentially the sharecropping system. Where the person who was working out in the fields and on plantations involuntarily forced and with the whip behind them with expectations and probably dying for being, actually dying for being overworked, no care and consideration, just profitability on the thought of the person that's driving it all. You now have that person who doesn't have to do it at least anymore. I mean, if he makes the decision to do it, nobody can go to the authorities. If he walks away from it, he doesn't have to worry about dogs chasing behind him because of it. But it's all he's ever known. And so he makes the decision to stay on doing it with the idea that there'll be somewhat of a compromise. All right, so the guy who owns the land, and in this way it begins to reflect basically what took place before the establishment of this country. And I've always said to myself, that's probably one of the greatest ironies in it all, even now, how willing those who are oppressed are willing to become the oppressor. How we're willing to do the same thing to others that have been done to us, as opposed to becoming disgusted by that idea and saying we would never do that to someone else. But you have basically the same setup, because with feudalism you have people who own the land, and then you have peasants, that were working underneath them, and they would work them from sundown to sunup, same kind of thing, just different complexion if you pay attention to those kinds of things. And then here in the U.S. you have pretty much the same thing, the plantation set up and people being worked from sundown to sunup. Sunset to sundown. But so following behind that, because of people just being disillusioned, they give it a try. I'll give you a certain share of what I grow, and you'll sell that off, and then you'll pay me afterwards. And when it comes time to pay, that's what's supposed to take place, is all of this is going to get put on a ship. And then the ship comes back and I have a check. And you know that ship sunk? And that's a running joke. Right? You know that ship sunk? How many times do you go through that before you just decide that you no longer want a part in that? And so that's what took place. This all leads up then now to people just, if they weren't already inclined to get away from the system as it exists, principally in the southern states, up to the north where there was this great promise of productivity and prosperity, and a lot of people had already left from that, at the cost and the risk of their lives. But now people who had initially made the decision to stay down in the southern states are pretty much deciding that they would like to move on to other pastures too. In addition to ideas like, is this really even right? If we've had people to fight to get us out of these circumstances into other circumstances and we're remaining in it, accepting these same things. So all of this leads to what they call a great migration. Right? So you have people who are moving from the southern states into the northern states. Chicago is one of those areas, it's one of the principal areas. People are coming up to Chicago with the idea that there's industry there, you can get a home and you can live a nice life, a nice comfortable life. You'll be able to provide for yourself and your children. And a lot of people are leaving the sharecropping system, which didn't just exist, in Mississippi where people who were dark and complected. There are people from Oklahoma who had the same story about being involved in sharecropping and it going bad and losing everything. And as opposed to people going to Chicago, it was a great migration to California for them. This is just another facet of it. Once again, this is the country trying to figure itself out in terms of an economic model. So people get up to Chicago. A lot of people are coming up from Mississippi. If you're talking about people who are in their 40s and their 50s, someone in the 30s, everybody has people in Mississippi, they say. Not really true, but that was the saying. Everybody got found in Mississippi. Everybody has people in Mississippi because of this time period, this great migration. And my family was pretty much the same way. I had some who came up from Mound, Bayou, and then some from another location. But so they get up here to Chicago then now after this time period. And you have some people who are capitalizing on the idea of jobs being available and prosperity associated with it. Not everybody's finding that. Sometimes it's part-time work. People are having to work 2 part-time jobs in order to try to take care of themselves. And along with that, it's not just them, it's their children. It's their family. So what does the child do? While mom, because already the idea of single parenthood was beginning to surface as people who are disillusioned, some of them are making the decision to go back down south. This city thing is not for me. And we see that kind of thing even today, with people who are from the southern or more rural background, and what takes place when they even come around sometimes people who are from an urban setting, let alone move into an urban setting themselves. Sometimes they acclimate, a lot of times they say to themselves, this is just not for me. So when that was taking place, you had a lot of men who were going back down south. They just weren't interested in being involved in city life. And women were making decisions over the state, like, I'm staying here. And so families were breaking apart because of that. In some cases, it wasn't the man who was leaving the north to go back down south. He was just leaving the family to go do other things. So you had single mothers even then beginning to be introduced into the equation. And she's working 2 jobs. And what does the child do then? And even if it's both parents there and they're trying to work to provide for the child is just still left to figure out what he's going to do for himself unless he's in school. And even if he is in school, at a certain point, school lets out. So he's out running the street, trying to figure things out. So this is where this whole idea of young people being out in the street really begins to develop a lot. And you have these various groups. Like if this was a school right now, very quickly, groups would start to develop. Like people with commonalities would begin to gather together in little groups and so forth. And so you had that same kind of thing. All these people coming up from Mississippi and children out in the street, and they began to form little groups in their neighborhoods. And this is the inception of what we have, or what we see today, and what they call street gangs, which are actually street organizations, street-size social organizations. They're not groups that started with some guy that's 50, 60 years old and says, you know what, I'm going to start an organization or a gang or whatever, and I'm going to get all of these. It was young children running around the neighborhood, parents at work, off doing whatever, in their little groups who decide to name themselves, 14, 15 years old. And what we see with these groups is essentially the progression of them, over the course of time since then. We're talking about like the 60s. The whole thing with the Civil War, we're talking about the middle 1800s. Like the 60s around there. And then going into what we call the Great Migration, when people are beginning to rethink things, it's like 30 years later, 3 decades later. So we're like at the beginning of the 1900s. And then by the 60s, 1960s and 70s, this is when you're having mass people move up north. And this is when you see also the emergence of all of these different groups, you know, not with the exact same name that they have now, but in many cases, definitely associated and with the same leaders as they're at their base and at their foundation. So that's essentially what we have in these different groups. And I mean, just as I was saying before, the progression of a male kind of mirrors the progression of these groups. Young men start out, you know, they're kind of feisty. You find somebody 12 years old, he's a lot more with
hormones and everything, testosterone.
Yeah. Then somebody who's 50 or 60 and you propose that idea to him, he's like, no.
Well, you know, with age comes wisdom. And you kind of settle down, which is true.